Your moderator today is a man named Richard Manning. He's the author of 7 books. His next book is Rebuilding the West, which is a book about fire. And today the panel will be talking about fire. It's kind of ironic that I'm introducing it. I'm the president of Fort Peck, Assiniboine Sioux Tribal College. We're in the eastern part of the state. We have 4 trees, I think, at the last count. So we haven't had much to do with the large wildfires, but I'm still very interested in the topic. Richard?
Thank you. I'm pleased to be doing this panel because I think this happens to be the most important issue. I'm sorry, Mike?
Yeah.
We got Mike?
Yeah, those are just click on them at the base, the very base.
The red light's on, you're on.
Yeah, we're on for the first section.
You made me resort to my glasses already. That's not fair. Okay, now we got a mic, right? We're living. I happen to think this is the most important issue in the West right now. And apparently the people who make up panels here agree with me because, you know, in the firefighting world, they have something called a type 1 crew or a hotshot crew. And in these 3 panelists here, they sent me a hotshot crew. There's no doubt about it. I'm going to give kind of a rambling introduction to this issue because I want you to understand, first of all, how this story weaves into our lives here, each one of us, and how these guys kind of weave together a little bit. And I kind of wish this room had windows, because we can tell this fire story just by pointing here, here, and here. If you've lived in any western town for any length of time, the stories are literally written on the landscape, and that's true of the Missoula Valley as any other. I first began thinking about this issue 20 years ago. This big brick, I'm going to point a lot, I'm sorry. The big brick building across the street, they used to publish a newspaper over there. And I was a reporter. And at the time I was covering fire, and fire was just one of those issues among many that I wrote about. And then in 1988, I got to cover the Yellowstone fires and the Canyon Creek fire, which blew up and ran 40 miles in a single night and ended up burning about 140,000 acres. And after that, I went in the year after with a bunch of biologists to look at the recovery of that fire and to think about fire. And a bunch of those biologists handed me some writings by Steve Pyne. And they said, you got to read this guy if you're going to understand anything about this. And after reading that, I came to understand rather quickly that you really can't sort out the issues in the West without looking at fire first. And at the same time, people were starting to talk about global warming 20 years ago. They made some very dire predictions about what my landscape would begin to look like. I took that knowledge with me as I went around the world writing about various issues. I mean, you can write about fire in Africa if you want to, and I used that lens to think about stuff all over the world. And then came a big change in the way the world worked. And people who live in this valley got it pretty fast. And some of those predictions that people talked about 20 years ago about global warming started to come very true. And so I can remember in 2003 that you could climb to the top of Sentinel and you could see 6 fires larger than 10,000 acres in a single day. And really, 20 years ago, we never thought that that would be possible. But then came 2007. 2007, I can remember this date very clearly because it's when I decided that fire was going to be the determining factor in our future, and I, by God, better go back and start writing about it again. And I live right up here in Greeno, above Greeno Park. And I walked out into my backyard, and it was one of those days that was unusual for that summer in that we could see the hills. That summer, we spent about 2 months not being able to see any of the hills around here for smoke, because we lived in smoke all that summer. But it had cleared off, and the wind had come up, and you could see smoke. We saw what looked like a mushroom cloud on the north edge of the valley, right? And those of us who have watched smoke for a while know what that means. It means some guys in yellow shirts are having a very interesting day, right? And it happened to be Tim Love's fire. It was the Jocko Lakes fire, right? And so he was the guy who had the interesting day that day. And that after the aftermath of that fire, a bunch of people told me, they were blunt about this. There was no swagger. They said, get ready to burn towns the size of Seeley Lake, and it's only the sheerest of luck we did not burn Seeley Lake that day. It was nothing to do with firefighting. And one of the things it would have burned, if it had burned Seeley Lake, was John McLean's cabin, right? And so you can write, in that stretch of space between the Missoula Valley and Seeley Lake, you can write a lot of the McLean history and think a lot about that. And so, in thinking about all these stories coming together, I started to read again Steve Pyne, as you should. And I wanted to understand fire policy and how it came together. And so, in reading about the evolution of fire policy, he told me about a guy named Evan Kelly, right? And Evan Kelly was a regional forester here. They called him Major Kelly. He rode around on a horse. He was one of these tough guys. It was pivotal in the evolution of the fire policy we have today. And I took particular interest in that because I live in Evan Kelly's house, literally. And so I've got this ghost that I communicate with on this fire issue and decided I better get back into it. And so I started interviews right away, and I ended up interviewing guys like Dick Mangan and Bob Much, who's here, and Wayne Williams, all people John knows really well, right? And when I did that, I started to feel very comfortable and being happy back writing about fire again. And I was reading John's book the other day and found a quote that explained to me why I was happy writing about fire the other. And he was quoting a guy named Brian Schultz, right? And the conversation at the time was why it was a good thing to have women become firefighters. And his answer was, there is no specific fire suppression task which requires a penis. You know, and John will verify this, firefighters are different guys. And that culture that evolved has learned something from nature, and it's shaped into a genuine culture. And that when we go out and interview these people, they explain things to us just that bluntly. And it's a privilege to work with them, and all of a sudden you're charged with a new responsibility as a writer to carry that story. It's very much a character-driven story, and these are real characters we get to work with all the time. So I'm pleased to have these three guys here today to talk about that. And we're going to open up what I hope will be a discussion, not a lot of presentations, despite my ramble here, with Steve Pyne. He wants to respond to the question here about a writer's responsibility to fire.
Well, thank you, and my thanks to the organizers for allowing me to come back to Missoula, which is one of the great fire towns in the U.S., and speak on the subject. Since the fire community always does things in threes, let me suggest a fire literature triangle, if you will, and look at the role of the writer, and then the role of fire in literature, and then very briefly my own role and how these come together. I think the role of the writer in this is fairly simple. It's our charge to express, to give expression to ideas, events, experiences, information, data. There are lots of people out there collecting and gathering information. We have scientists, we have scholars, we have journalists. Lots of information. The writer's particular responsibility is to find a medium to help convey that message and give that extra value added that comes by finding the right way to put it forth. Interesting question, though, about fire. Is there anything special about fire that would require a different medium? Could there be a fire genre? Or does fire simply fit in to all the existing varieties we have? For the most part, fire literature falls into disaster literature. It falls into a kind of a war literature. The firefight is battlefield. It's sort of our default setting. That's where it always goes. And we keep deferring to that. It's very hard to get beyond that. That's part of the problem with policy changes. We don't have a story to tell that fits these kinds of modes of expression. Increasingly, we have kind of memoir-driven literature, and people using fire to meditate on various kinds of stuff, and that dates pretty specifically back to Young Men in Fire, I think. I think if I were a betting man, I would, and I'm not, I would wager that pattern will continue, and that fire will continue to fit in to some of these other forms. But in some ways, that leaves us with the sense that fire is interchangeable with earthquakes or floods or riots. It's not going to reform. It doesn't demand a special kind of expression on its own. I'm not sure I completely accept that, and let me suggest very quickly a few ideas about fire that suggest ways in which we might think about tweaking these formulas in other ways. And one is that among the ancient elements, fire is not a substance. It's a reaction. Earth, air, water, you can put them in a bucket, carry them around. You can't carry fire in the same way. You carry the things that make fire up. In fact, you can carry those things separately and not have fire. It's a reaction. That means it comes with its own narrative structure. It has a beginning, middle, and end. It moves, it acts. Fire can be animated, inherently animated in ways that these others cannot. So I think that there are possibilities here for animating without anthropomorphizing, which is a pretty fast ticket to critical scorn and obscurity. But there are ways to bring fire alive. And I mean that almost literally, because fire is biologically constructed. We think of fire ecology very often now, but we think of fire as a physical, chemical event that impacts the biological world, much as a flood or a windstorm or an ice storm might. I would argue instead that fire literally relies on that biological matrix. Life creates the oxygen, life creates the fuel, and in the form of people, life supplies most of the ignitions. This is very much a creation of the living world that is shaped by physical parameters. We have it reversed. And I think if we were able to reverse that, that suggests some literary possibilities, but it also suggests that we ought to be thinking about biological controls, because if we only think of this as a physical event, then we're going to only rely on physical countermeasures, which is basically what we do. And the third observation I would have is that we have a species monopoly over the manipulation of fire. You know, other creatures knock over trees, dig holes in the ground, hunt, eat plants. We do fire. We have always done fire. We alone have done fire. This is a unique signature of who we are as ecological agents. And that has brought fire into a moral world in ways that other things have not. It's a great index of who we are, and it should be embedded in our cultural understanding. It's astonishing to me how much societies vary in their appreciation of fire. The US actually has a very robust fire literature, poetry, art. So does Australia. So does Russia. Go to Canada and there's nothing. Try to find a painting of a forest fire in Canada. There's a huge disconnect on these things. So you just go across the border. We're always told borders don't matter. Fire ignores borders. That's absolute nonsense. Land use changes, cultural practices, institutions, enormous borders. Well, finally, where do I try to fit in on this? My story is a very simple one. I started working on a fire crew rather by accident a few days after I graduated from high school. I kept coming back for 15 years. In the meantime, I went to college, I went to graduate school, wrote a dissertation. Absolutely none of that schooling had anything whatsoever to do with fire. They were two absolutely different worlds. And finally, I realized what I should do is take the training I'd been given and apply that to the subject, which was really most interesting to me, which was fire. And so my particular effort to express fire has come through the way I was trained to write, which is basically in scholarship, and to try to bond fire to larger themes in the culture, particularly in the humanities, and to try to bring some sense of it to a group that had not regarded fire as an object of study or of interest. I've tried to move beyond that, to broaden it out to reach a larger group. I would like to think of myself now as a fire critic, in the same way that we have literary critics or art critics. We have commentators on sports events. We have more books on yoga or gardening than we have on fire. Why isn't it more deeply embedded in our cultural conversations? We discuss things, but we don't discuss it with the normal kind of give and take that we would apply, say, to a World Series Why don't we think of the fire ending seasons in California as a kind of World Series of the season? How does this year stack up with others? How can we talk about it? It sounds a bit eerie, perhaps, but in some ways we're not able to discuss it in the same way and to bring that rich cultural understanding to bear on fire. And I would see that as my particular mission, and that is what I've tried to do. There are reasons why academic is a pejorative term, so let me shut up before I demonstrate it.
I'd like for Tim to respond to that a little bit right now, because he sees things from the other side. And in a very real effect, when we screw up as writers, he has to deal with the consequences, because we're shaping that public story. And he's the guy that sits at the front of the room, full of sometimes very angry people, pitchfork wavers, the whole 9 yards. And so I'd like to hear how he thinks our responsibility shapes that discussion.
Okay, yep, I'll give it a shot and help me clarify if needs exist. First of all, I want to say it's a huge honor and it's very humbling to sit between two men who were giants in the fire literature, and who I've met and know well and learned a lot from. And I'll say that about Bob Mutch, who's in the audience as well. I've been one of his students for a very long time. And John Anderson, who's also in the audience, probably the best air attack officer that I've ever met in my career. So there's a lot of people that have far more knowledge on this subject.
Tim, can you give the mic a little more?
Okay, there's people that have far more knowledge on this subject than I do, but I'm not an author. My responsibilities with the Forest Service started in 1975 when I was at college here at the university, and I studied fire under Bob Steele, and we learned about fires like Sundance and Sleeping Child and the great impact that those fires caused. At the time, they were benchmarks in how severe and how large fires can grow. 50,000 acres in a burning period was a huge thing, and today the lid has been blown off those standards, that's for sure. But just specifically, give me another question that I can help answer beyond that in terms of my experience.
Well, let's go another way with that. Let's talk about pet peeves, for instance. I have a pet peeve. Every time I hear somebody on the radio say, 10,000 acres were destroyed by fire, I want to leap through the speaker and choke the son of a bitch, right? And what's going to happen? We're going to go over to that spot on the landscape and see a missing 10,000 acres, a void where the 10,000 acres used to be. So what's your pet peeve when you hear somebody reporting about fire and saying, damn, that's making my hard job, or I wish they wouldn't say those things?
Well, there's so much, hyperbole, and there's used to describe fire in those sorts of ways. And, when you're involved in managing fires and working with them, that what the public consumes, not in books that these gentlemen have written, but oftentimes the subject is treated so superficially, and it is complex, and there's a lot involved, and it's hard to describe in concise ways what those impacts are. People have a great fear of fire. I have learned that over the years. There's to the point of phobias, and how those effects are described and exaggerated in their own minds, and in what people hear about fires and that devastation and is misleading for certain, even when people are closer to it and affected in a community by it. Trying to help people understand what's really involved in.
What would you like to see from writers?
Well, that's a tough question. I think journalists at the newspaper level that have different beats, and they come in and out of beats. Outdoor writers who take that subject on may have a brief exposure to it, and then they're students of it. Like Richard Manning, you'll have a better understanding and can explain it better to the public. But, it's trying to describe the real issues.
Microphone, speaker.
Okay. Just trying to be realistic about what's at threat and what the real concerns are.
I'm going to let John weigh into this now and say whatever he likes, or if not, I'll have a question.
I'd like to just second what Tim just said. I've written about fire for almost 15 years, and I was a newspaperman for 30 years before that. And when I came into the fire field and wrote my first book, I went looking for fire literature. And really the only helpful thing I found was Steve Pyne and my father's book, Young Men in Fire. And they couldn't be more different. I mean, Steve gives you, in Fire in America, which is, my copy of it is so dog-eared and overmarked, you know, some things underlined 3 times. That's the Bible. But that's all there was. You have this book, Young Men on Fire, that is almost Shakespearean in the way it approaches fire. Nobody else has done that. I don't try to do it. Somebody else who tries it had better be very careful because it's a slippery slope. And then you have somebody like Steve who has written over and over and over again about fire in a highly detailed way. And if you try to do that, you'd better watch out. You'd better do what he did, which is be a firefighter to start with. Find a university where you can teach it. Marinate yourself in this for a full career. Produce book after book after book. Stay on top of the issue. So that's what there was, plus the personal memoirs. I'll never fight fire with my bare hands again. Or fly the biggest piece back. And these are good, adventuresome stories. Those are both actual titles of books, but they're personal memoirs. So that isn't really a literature, that's a start. 15 years later, you have got a welter of literature out there. Dozens and dozens of books, and it divides very cleanly for me. This is my competition, I don't do anything else, this is how I make a living. Between the people who stick it out and the people who jump in, one book, one story, one magazine piece, and they're off to something else. One of the worst examples, and I won't name the author, but it isn't hard to find, was a fellow who wrote a book of stories about a variety of subjects, called the book by the name Fire, did the South Canyon fire by picking up the official report and talking to about 3 people, and then went on to do other things. So what's happening now is that people such as Dick Manning are realizing that this isn't just a one-off. This is a continuing, building story. I don't try to set policy in concrete when I write a book, because I know that by the time it comes out, the policy is going to be different. I try to kind of point ahead and say, this is a fatal fire, here are the lessons learned, and they're trying to work with these, and guess what? They're coming up with a lot of stuff. And leave it there. Let the professionals deal with the matter of how you apply the lessons of the South Canyon fire, or the 30 Mile fire, or the Rattlesnake fire even, that was from the 50s. And to tell people stories that they can understand. That's my job. That's what I do. The stories where you can identify with people who are firefighters, who are threatened by fire, some of whom die, some of whom survive kind of wonderfully and almost magically. That's my gig. I'm trying to expand it in my next book because I think, as Dick Manning does, that this is a very broad issue, a big story, and you need to get some of that into it. But if you read Steve Pyne's book, Year of the Fires, which is about the 1910 fires, the primary message out of that is after 1910, we had a way of looking at fire. Not everybody agreed with it. Not everybody agreed with the full suppression policy. There are people off in California who are lighting the hills on fire every fall. Still, there are people in the Southeast who did that, still. So it wasn't as though there were universal agreement, but that was the policy. The government did it. It was the one that was written down on paper. The guys who were in charge and rode around on horses and called themselves by military rank enforced it. And there is nothing today, even remotely, like that. It's a free-for-all out there. And the forest fire fighters are left with the consequences of that. They're not getting what I would regard as adequate support from the culture. That's what killed people on the South Canyon fire, was the culture in a variety of different ways. You had an old-time aggressive culture of putting out fire with a kind of inability to bring all the technology to bear that should be brought to bear, and people not living up to the code, and why did we fight this fire anyway? Should it have been fought? And those kinds of questions hovering in the background, and the firefighters were left with the consequences of our confusion about fire. Steve said, why is fire different? I had that discussion yesterday with Jack Cohn at the Fire Lab. Known to many of you, he is a fire scientist. And we were trying to figure out, why is fire different from an earthquake or a tornado? Why do we write about it? Why do I write about it? And if you know Jack, he's a contrarian, and he plays devil's advocate, and he does a very good job of it. And we came up with some reason to add to what Steve said. First of all, firefighting, big fire, is a rare experience. That's one reason people kind of like it and get excited by it. It's a rare experience for firefighters. How many firefighters, wildland firefighters, go to more than one big fire per year? Doesn't happen that often. It is awesome visually, which is what gets the one-offs into it. People run out, they take the pictures, they do the stories, it's on cable TV, and then boom, that's it. One of my favorite cable television scenarios was during a big fire bust in California, where President Bush had finally decided to go to every natural disaster that occurred because he'd blown it on Katrina. So he was there. And cable TV was doing it live, and I was switching among the channels to see if everybody was doing what everybody was doing, MSNBC, CNN, and so on. They're all full screen Bush. Now I'd like to introduce Governor Schwarzenegger. They're all full screen Schwarzenegger. And he gets up, and we're going to make everything right for everybody. Bush said the same thing. It's all going to come out right for you. We're going to take care of you. And Schwarzenegger said, I'd like to introduce the head of CAL FIRE, what's now CAL FIRE, CDF, California Forestry and Fire Protection. And this great big guy, but weighs about 300 pounds, Ruben Grijalva, gets on the screen. He said, well, I'd like to talk to you about land use issues. And that big screen went like that, and the sound went click. And a little blonde girl came on and said, California's burning, and Bush and Schwarzenegger are going to make everything okay. That's what's wrong. The government's not going to make everything okay. They didn't start the fire. It's part of a natural process. It's getting worse. You can't blame them every time there's a fire, even when it's an arson start. The responsibility is on the people who are watching it, and it hasn't been placed there. The responsibility should be on the homeowners, the people living in the wildland-urban interface. I know that they can't be responsible for more than their 4 acres or 40 acres or whatever it is, and their neighbor may not do anything and they may get burned out by it. But that's where it should start, and it doesn't today. It starts with everybody expecting Tim Love to solve their problem. I wrote a foreword for Steve's book, Year of the Fires, and I wrote about the Jocko Lakes fire, Tim Love's fire. And I was involved in that, and the Jocko Lakes fire started a couple of weeks before the Jocko Lakes fire started. It was a little smoke that was spotted, and they couldn't find the fire. And then a couple of weeks later, it blew up. And there are a lot of people who were really angry about that. They were angry that they didn't go out there and find that fire and put it out. That's what the government should be doing. If you've ever looked for a little fire in a pickup sticks forest that goes on for hundreds of thousands of acres, even if you have the coordinates, you've got quite a job. I've looked for them and been unable to find them. It isn't 10 acres. It isn't a half an acre. Sometimes it's something just like the tip of your finger. That's literally true. I went out with a helicopter crew in Yellowstone Park, and we were looking for the wrong fire. That was the name of it, the wrong fire. And it had been burning, and it said, let a natural burn go, and it had to be monitored. And I went there with 2 professional firefighters. We spent an hour and a half looking for that thing. And 2 of us, myself and one other guy, couldn't find it. Finally, the third guy found it in a little root ball. There's a little smoke that would come up, and then there wouldn't be any smoke. I don't think Tim Love was responsible for that. I don't think the Bureau of Indian Affairs was responsible for it. I've talked to the people who went looking for that fire. They sent people out for a couple of days. They sent air guys out later. They couldn't find it. It blew up, and thanks to luck and a lot of good firefighting, they kept that thing out of the town of Seeley Lake and away from my cabin. A little talk with Tim it was late June, early July, before the fire happened. I had him out to the cabin. He's my ranger, and we've been friends for a long time. And I said very quietly, and I don't know whether it even got through, I said, Tim, if this thing goes this year, because it sure looks like it's going to go. Grass is really high. It's 100 degrees in Missoula in late June, early July. That doesn't happen. If we get the big one, if we get the big one, I don't want any firefighters putting up their back against the wall and endangering themselves for my cabin. That's really easy to say in June. It's not easy to say when the fire is on its way. And I was in Alaska seeing a son of mine when the fire hit. I was able to cover it on the internet, by telephone with Tim and Wayne Williams, and I might as well have been, 40 miles away from the fire. I mean, you had a lot of access to what was going on. And I hope Tim will back me up. I never said, what are you guys doing about my cabin? That cabin was built from the forest. The logs were cut right there. It is part of the forest. I had done everything I could think of doing before the fire hit. Tim Love had done a forest thinning project right around my cabin. We'd done our job. If the forest went, then the cabin, I thought, should go with it. We came in together, we go out together. That's not the attitude you get in this country today.
Not even close. I'm reminded here that when you talk about Schwarzenegger, one of his quotes was, "We need federal funds to rebuild this immediately right here." And he had said, that was in 2008, he said exactly the same thing in 2004 about some of the same acres that were burned during that fire. So that's the response in our culture. We need federal funds to protect us immediately from this. Now, I'm going to try a literary question here, but I think it's pertinent to all of this. And I happened to be reading the Icelandic sagas of all things a few weeks ago, and those are 1,000-year-old stories, our oldest recorded stories, and they're hero-driven. That's it. And it's something that's fairly interesting about Western culture and Western literature, that we don't have a story until we have a hero, and that hero is pulling us along. And this particular story of fire becomes irresistible on that basis, which is why people jump in and out of it all the time, because we got lights and sirens, and we've got the slurry drops are coming to be called money shots on CNN now, when they drop the slurry into the fire. Those kinds of things are irresistible because they have heroes, and it's there. But it's occurring to me now that some of the heroes out there, some of the people who are doing the real service, are the guys who say, it's not worth it. I'm not going to risk my life for that fire. Let the rich guy's house burn. Okay. That is something that not only do we not make that guy a hero for doing that, but we don't even write about it. There'll never be a word written about that. And so we don't reinforce it as a culture. And I'm wondering here, of the three of you now, what are the way we tell stories with heroes, is that somehow doing a disservice to this subject? And do we really need a new way of looking at our literature that is not hero-driven? Have at it.
Well, if the trophy home happened to be owned by a stockbroker, you could probably walk away from it today. The conflagration on Wall Street, I think, is going to take over the rest. Oh, I think you raise an interesting point, though. It strikes me in fire literature, the classic literature, it is hero-driven, it is an adventure story. And the problem we face writing a different one is I was reminded, oddly, of Milton's problem. How do you have a Christian hero? How do you convert the pagan hero into a Christian one, which is based on a totally different ethos? And in some ways, he never solved it. I mean, Satan turns out to be a lot more interesting in Paradise Lost than the other protagonists. I don't know, but I think you have to shift, and part of the shift, I mean, if I knew how to do that, I'd do it. Part of my interest in writing Year of the Fires was to see how do you create a founding story, and what does it take? And what it takes is a lot of things that are not in your control. I'll go back to fire as a reaction. Fire is what its circumstances make it. And you can't, in a sense, you tell the story of fire by controlling the setting. You understand fire setting, you understand the fire, you control the setting, you control fire. If we're back to John's arsonist issue, the way you control arson is by controlling the landscape. Or to introduce CAL FIRE in here, let me talk about land use for a minute and have everybody leave the room. They'll be bored, they want to hear stories, big stories. I think maybe you could shift it to the settings, more of the context, and you would have to have multiple personalities coming in, but ultimately the setting would drive it, and that would have to carry the story. And you would have to unload some of the narrative burden onto fire itself, and I think it can do that without anthropomorphizing by letting it animate itself. It can have the role of a character without you going overboard and granting it that standing. I think that's what it would take. How to actually do it, I don't know.
Well, I think that the simple-minded hero of stereotypical literature is not the fire hero. And without getting pejorative about it, that was the fire hero of most of the 20th century was Pulaski. That's the archetypal story. He's the leader of the crew of stumblebums during the 1910 fire. At near sacrifice of his own life, he saves everybody else. They don't understand what he's doing. He has to save them at pistol point, and he does it. And the aftermath is a wonderful story because he creates the Pulaski fire tool and has a very sad personal story, both in his relationship with the Forest Service and in his relationship with his health, which was shattered by the 1910 fire. So he's the hero that you see stomping through the woods, doing his best against an overwhelming enemy, fire. That doesn't work anymore, that type. My heroes, I think, are people who make mistakes, stumble around a bit themselves, but absolutely do their best under horrible circumstances where they're not fully supported by their own organization, where they're misdirected by their own organization, and somehow they find ways to redeem themselves as human beings and as firefighters. Certainly that's Don Mackey in Fire on the Mountain. What compelled me about him still does, is that he had a moment when he'd made a lot of mistakes and put people in harm's way. He had done his best. There was a rationale for what he'd done, but he had a choice. And I used to go, and still do go, and stand where he stood when he made that choice. His father and I went and located the spot within 10 feet, where he could have either turned and gone uphill with Missoula smoke jumpers that he had directed to safety, or he could turn and go back along the fire line and clear the line of the people who were there, 12 people. Knowing that that was perhaps not a fatal decision, but certainly a less desirable decision than going up where he knew it was safe. And he went back for the other people. That's his redemptive moment. That's a fairly complex hero. And that model hasn't really stopped. I'm not sure who the heroes are, if there are any, in the 30 Mile Fire. I think that is a story without, it's a story with brave acts, but without real heroes. And I think that that's what you're left with in fire literature, that we don't have a single stereotypical Pulaski, Ranger Pulaski. He doesn't stand up there and then you just repeat that one and you've got your story. You look at these people, I try to look at them as individuals and make them somebody you might meet. They're not just this uniform yellow shirts and green pants. They're your sons and daughters. They are people you could run into on the street and they could perhaps be you with all those flaws.
I guess it sets itself up for heroes because there are great risks and harm, and there certainly is a lot of danger. And a lot of people, to me, that are heroes are people that, you would not know about, you would not read about, you would not hear about. It's guys like John Henderson who dehydrate themselves and go up in an airplane for 5 or 7 hours and fly in circles. And they're directing air traffic, a lot of it, and they're keeping people out of harm's way. And I'm listening to that discussion going on, and as a friend of mine said, it's humbling listening to somebody like that, somebody that's really keeping people out of trouble. But most people would never know that. Most people never hear that or see that because they do their jobs in an unassuming way every day, and they do it well. And they keep people safe. So there's a lot of heroes out there, but you'll never know them, and it's likely you'll never read about them. But they do a great job.
Yeah, that whole aspect's probably a tension within the agency as well, though, because if you think about hard times and short budgets and all those things, that you have plenty of attention that gets paid to firefighters, smoke jumpers, aviation, all those things. But when you have to do that plodding hard work of management, then you guys end up getting the short end of the stick on that, the kind of stuff that has to go on to manage a forest every day. Is that becoming more of a problem or less of a problem in the time we're in now?
Because of fires?
Yeah. I mean, fire, look at the proportion of the Forest Service budget it's eating now. I
Yeah.
mean, it gets what it wants in that agency, and so when the money goes away, there's less money for managing a forest, and this has to play into that whole hero aspect and attention and lights and sirens and all that. Is that a tension within the agency, and how's that resolving?
Well, yeah, it is. Frankly, about 50% of our budget in the Forest Service goes to, in one form or fashion, fire management or operations. It used to be historically maybe 20%. We spent $1.6 billion in the Forest Service in some fashion managing fires. And fire has a lot of glamour because there's a lot of action, and because of the things I said, there's a lot of risks and dangers and such. But the rest of the work that we do is, that part of the budget just keeps contracting, and there are less resources and there are less people, and it's harder to do the work because our capacity is just shrinking. And we're spending more money, we're burning lots of acres. This past year we burnt less than we did previously, but we're spending as much money or more money. And fires are becoming more severe and far more dangerous than they ever have been in history, I think.
And that factors into what we do as writers, because 20 years ago, I recall, there was, I think, better follow-up on fires and biological information, for instance. There were biologists out there doing the work, telling us what was going on, and that was a story we had access to and could tell. And now, if we spend all our time firefighting, then that's what we have out of you guys to tell, and so we feel that shortage as well. A lot of what we're looking at here is a moving target. Global warming makes fire a moving target because conditions are changing very rapidly, but also our society is changing very rapidly, and we've evolved into a chicken little society now that expects government to protect us from all things. One of the things that is a moving target in this is journalism, that aspect of writing that John knows well and that I've worked in, and it has shifted over the years. And I'd like to have your observations, John, on how journalism changes, the evolution of journalism is affecting our ability to tell this story.
Well, what happens with the good guys is that they get into the smoke and flame story, and they get interested enough to continue on afterward, and maybe even write a book or do a long series, and those contribute a lot. I don't think there's much question that the Yellowstone fires of '88 were the biggest thing, certainly since Man Gulch. and were bigger than Man Gulch in that they involved lots of journalists. The number of books written about that fire, if you want to call it one fire, the Yellowstone fires of '88, is phenomenal. And the trouble is that they haven't lasted. You know, they're there and then they're gone because they're policy books and how it changed policy. It's a fabulous policy story. I mean, it did change policy, or at least tested National Park Service policy. The whole nation was captivated by it, but it doesn't have a hero. I mean, it doesn't have 5 firefighters standing against the flames. Some of them make it, some of them don't. There's a race. I mean, it doesn't have the essential elements of storytelling on the level of that begins to imitate Young Men on Fire or what happened on Storm King, the South Canyon fire. And I think that's what you need to carry it from journalism into something that is around for 25 years in hardcover or even in trade paperback. There are a lot more journalists covering this stuff today. Some of them take the trouble to go get a red card, to take the courses, to learn the game. Most of them don't, but that's also the nature of journalism, as we both know. You know, you jump in, you jump out. There are maybe 3 or 4 really good people now in journalism who have studied this stuff and written about it and continue to practice journalism. So there is no dearth of information. The trouble is that what we're getting is information about a situation that is as screwed up as the global financial situation is today. It isn't as dramatic because you don't see the thing going down 350 points one day and up 450 the next, except during fire season. But there is no compatibility understanding of fire on the part of this country. You talk about the Forest Service spending more than half its budget on fire and starving recreation programs and trail building programs and maintenance programs. That's going to be fixed with the flame legislation, which is passed the House and not the Senate, or the other way around. It's not going to be fixed. All they're doing is taking that item away from the Forest Service and putting it at the same level outside there. Well, that'll bring things back within the Forest Service, one hopes, where they can spend more money on things other than fire. But it doesn't change anything about how you fight fire. By the way, I don't have the answer. I mean, there are people in this room, probably 10 people in this room who should be sitting up here or more. There are a lot of experts out there. And I don't presume to tell people like that how to run their show. I really don't. But I'm an observer and a journalist, and I can tell you that the thing isn't working, and that to hammer away at fire suppression as the answer and spending more money as the answer is to put people in harm's way for no good cause. Politically, switching off of that has proved impossible. The difference between 1910 and today, among other things, is you have millions and millions more people with fancy homes and homes of other description in the interface. And that has changed the whole equation. And when you sit around, as sometimes happens, and people start talking about, well, we have to look back at what Native Americans did with fire, because they burned all the time. And even the European settlers, when they first arrived on the East Coast, burned all the time. There's a model. Not anymore. It isn't the model anymore. There are too many people. There's too much daily television on it. You know, it used to be that you'd have a 10, 15,000 acre fire in the backcountry in Montana and you never heard about it. You know, now you have a 745 acre fire near Los Angeles. And I swear to God, the country's burning down. If you read, watch TV or read, not in the papers, it doesn't make the papers. You know, and somebody did die in that fire. You know how many people die in fires? 9 a day in this country die in fires. That's the average. 3,000 to 4,000 people per year die in fires. These are structure fires. One guy dies in a 750 acre fire near LA, and it's all over cable TV. Now there's something wrong with that approach. journalistically, and it isn't just us guys who do it. People want it. They want the flames, they want the thrill, they want the jolt, and they don't have a sense of compatibility with fire anymore. They didn't grow up with fire, they didn't grow up using fire all over the place. As Steve Pyne says, we are a fire animal. It's what we've always done. Well, we don't do it anymore. Or it's a mistake, a kid playing with matches. Who lives with fire? Who cuts their own wood, hauls their own water, burns their own brush, lives like a ranch kid, lives in timber, isn't afraid of fire, feels comfortable around it? A lot of people in this room. But once you get past this room into the broader world, that percentage goes to close to nil.
I respond to a couple of observations. One is to merge your observations with Dick's on global warming. Global warming, to the extent that it's shaped by anthropogenic changes, is a fire story. We have changed our combustion habits as a species, how we choose to apply fire. We'll do it through machines. We'll do it secondhand. Everything about this room is shaped by fire, from the exit signs to the sprinklers, to the automatic alarms, to the number of people who can reside in it, to the composition of the chairs and the rest of it, but you wouldn't see it. It's all been sublimated, and that's what's happening generally. But we're finding that because of that, we are unhinging the global climate with lots of other consequences, and that's going to make it a lot harder to say that open flame is good. And the idea that we're just going to reintroduce open flame as an ecological balm, or pixie dust scattered over the landscape, isn't going to work. You're going to have very powerful ecological arguments for why you want that fire. And to say that it's reducing fuel, I don't think is going to survive. You'll be told, find another way to reduce fuel. Burn it up as biomass, wood chip it, do something else. If all you're doing is using open fire to rearrange hydrocarbons in the landscape, there are a lot of other options. That's not going to succeed. But I'd like to follow up on the Yellowstone thing. I think John, exactly correct. Prior to '88, fire in the general culture, certainly the media culture, was just an odd act of random violence. It was reported like a grizzly bear attack or somebody killed by snake bite or something, some freakish thing that happens out west. After '88, it got embedded into the media cycle, so they're primed, they're ready for it, and they need to have that 750-acre fire because they've got time, I think, slotted for it, and they know how to. They need to fill it. But I think Yellowstone was a great event in advertising new policies to the public. I think it was also a great lost opportunity by the fire community because I think the wrong question was asked at Yellowstone. And the question that got asked largely by apologists for the policy was whether fire belongs in Yellowstone. And the answer to that is easy. Of course it belongs. The real question was, how does it belong? How do you put it in? How much? By what means? Under what social compact do we make this arrangement? That's the discussion that didn't happen and in some ways still has not happened. We're approaching 50 years from the opening salvo of the fire revolution. We dated from '62, the first Tall Timbers Conference, '63, the Leopold Report, '64, the Wilderness Act. Those are what set into motion the whole cascade of reforms that dismantled the 10 a.m. policy in its single directive, which told everybody very clearly what to do and how to measure success. That's dismantled. We don't have a positive set of guidelines to replace it. What we have is, well, you don't have to do this. We don't have a complementary set of engagement, rules of engagement. This is how you do it to meet the appropriate ends. So I think in that sense, the confusion still prevails. And a lot of that confusion is not whether it's to put fire out or to put it back in, it's how are we going to put it back in? It's the internal divisions. When the opening fire revolution began, it had really two poles, one in Florida and one in California. And one really targeted working landscapes and the other was really interested in wild landscapes. Very different approaches, very different problems. They all had a common enemy, this fire suppression juggernaut. But having taken that down, Now the internal divisions, which are actually multiplying, have to be addressed. They're not all the same. We don't have a fire problem in the United States or in the West. We have lots of fire problems. They have different kinds of solutions. Some have technical. There's no reason to have houses burn. We know how to fix that. We've known for 10,000 years how to keep houses from burning. We just have to decide we want it. We don't know what to do in wilderness areas. We'll never know. That's going to be a cultural choice. But we can disaggregate the fire problem into lots of its smaller parts, take on those. There are a lot of things we can do. But I think that there really is a prevailing sense of confusion, and our response, certainly over the last few years, has been to do continued suppression, but that's the same response we've seen nationally politically. We'll have a summer surge. We'll just pump in more stuff, and we'll fight down the ecological insurgency that we created years ago. And it's not going to work. And enthusiasm for suppression waxes and wanes with the general enthusiasm for military action in the U.S. It's not an accident that fire reforms occurred in the 1960s at a time when the Vietnam War led to great questioning of continued military action as a possible solution. And so it was easy to pair them together, and we'll have to see whether our current misadventures in the Middle East will have a similar reflection on how we fight fire in the backcountry.
If I could just add one quick writerly note. When I started writing about fire, I kept looking for models. And the models that I found were all combat literature. And I became a great aficionado of combat literature. I still am. I mean, there's some really wonderful stuff out there. But that's the same ethic. It happens the same way. If you changed battle to fire, you would have the same stories. Tomorrow there's a panel on my dad's book, The Norman McLean Reader. And the book starts out with a couple of chapters on the Custer battle. And I read the first page and a half or so as an introduction to it and ask the audience to substitute the word fire and Man Gulch for battle and Custer fight, wherever it occurs. And if you do that, it's eerie because it's exactly the same story. So there is this link between combat and fire. And in writing about it, I will tell you, it's a very real and to me, an extremely useful one.
And explicit at one point, wasn't it, Steve, that moral equivalent of war brought into it?
Yeah, and it's even more explicit than that because the federal involvement in firefighting began with the
Army.
With the Army. The U.S. Cavalry rode into Yellowstone in 1886. They were greeted by fires. They put 60 fires out that summer. That's the model. And the National Academy of Sciences recommended on that experience, plus the British experience in colonial India primarily, French and Algeria, what a model, that we in effect created a corps of forest engineers, teach it at West Point, and have the Army for the near future run it. It didn't happen because the Spanish-American War gave the military something else to do. So they had to put down insurrection in the Philippines instead. But that was the model. That is where it emerged.
With military people. John's question earlier about why the big deal over LA fires, it caused me to remember a practice at a paper I was at one time, I forget which one, and you'd be handed written assignments on a memo pad. And occasionally there would be a little window, a drawing of a window written down in the corner of the memo. And what that meant was the publisher had seen that story out the window. And so you better get your ass on it and do a good job of it. That's why they make a big deal out of fires around LA. I want to follow up on something that Steve said earlier about the choice of using open flame with global warming and people becoming far less tolerant of it. And that kind of goes against something firefighters were telling me after 2008 season, or 7, I'm sorry, saying that, we don't have a choice anymore, that these fires are now writing their own rules, and that we're going to do what they tell us to do, and that the open flame thing is not an open question. I mean, how does that square with what you know?
Well, let me talk about land use. We have a lot of choices. and what kind of open flame we're going to have. By how we choose to arrange the vegetation on the landscape. And it doesn't necessarily mean chainsaws. It could be some kind of controlled browsing, grazing. We haven't even begun sort of biological control methods and the rest. How we choose to use the land. I can track the increase in burned area, certainly in my part of the world, the Southwest, very clearly with changes in land use and with changes in fire policy. I mean, we've had a doubling in 10 years. It doubled in 1996, the largest fire, 60,000 acres, doubled the preceding largest figure. That doubled twice in the next 10 years. It went to 120,000, then to 240,000, and that was very much a decision about how you're going to fight the fire, plus decisions about land use, what you want. So global warming or not, there are all these other intervening variables to come in. So we have a lot that we can do about determining what kinds of fires we occur. And finally, we could get serious about doing the burning ourselves. And that's going to require other reforms in tort legislation, in other kinds of things. But if we choose to have that open fire, we can. I think that the argument that we don't have any choice won't hold. You're going to be told you'll have to make a choice, and the choice is whether we bundle it all up in wood chips and send it out to a power plant of some sort, or whether we allow it to free burn. The choice, if you want fire, I think that decision will have to be made on the ecological work that fire does. That you are going to keep free burning fire for the same reason we have grizzlies and wolves. That we want the ecological integrity of that work. We want that biological work done, that nothing else can substitute for it. If all we're talking about is fuel and having big fires because there's too much fuel in the land, there are a lot of ways to do it. And heaven forbid, given the magnitude of the federal deficit, it's not inconceivable that we start selling the only asset we've got, which are the federal lands, to pay it off.
Yeah.
Other than that, or the outlying states.
Nominations
I
are in order.
reject the argument that we don't have choice. We have choices all over the place. Good choices, bad choices, repugnant choices, and intriguing choices. But there are choices all over the place, and the idea that we can't do anything because of global warming, I reject as nonsense.
You know, and I guess I agree with that, but then I wish I had a window again. You know, to point, because there's a fire scar right over here in Mount Sentinel of a fire this summer, right? And this summer, we had an off year. I mean, it was cold, the conditions were just right for burning Mount Sentinel and letting it burn hard. And not only that, the community is here that understands that, the Forest Service itself. I mean, there's more enlightenment about fire here than any place else. So why in the hell couldn't they let Mount Sentinel go ahead and burn instead of standing on it and showing the people of Missoula, here's your evolving story, instead of going old school on it almost to the 10 a.m. rule. And if it can't happen here, where is it going to happen?
You know, that's what drives our policy and why we do what we do. It's difficult. You can talk to people about the role of fire in the environment and how essential it is, and it's a normal function of our forest, but when people are threatened by fire, their only concern is put it out, and the sooner the better. And that's what we do. And, you know, you can't have discussions that when people are most attentive to what fire is doing and talk about that beneficial role. It's no, put it out, do it now. And people that are responsible for making decisions respond to that. And you know, God help the poor line officer or fire manager that makes a wrong decision and things go bad. And that's in the mind of anybody who's making decisions. And it has a strong influence on their behavior and how we manage fire.
You know, and I think that is fundamental to this story, and one that is evolving. within your agency much faster and something we need to know on the outside better. I think that this issue has forced Forest Service people to deal with chaos better than most and understand how to manage in chaotic conditions far ahead of the rest of the world. And there's almost a humility that comes out of this when you talk to these guys. Like, you know, we're not in charge anymore. And that's something we need to know on the outside, but it's that message alone is being filtered out and not getting out, I think, as much as it could, because it's something we richly need to know.
Well, you know, let me just say that sometimes decisions that are made are symbolic decisions. We're going to drop some retardant here, not so much because it's going to be effective, but because the public can see that you're doing something and that you're trying. And you're going to be a hero if things work out right. But if you don't do anything, even, and you know its effectiveness is extremely limited at times it can be very effective, decisions are being made like that. You're doing it, and it's a symbolic act.
By the way, we don't mean to completely monopolize the discussion here.
Well, we have.
I'll take questions if people want to follow up on any given point. Other than that, but absent questions, will continue to monopolize. Yes. That's fine.
Why do you think there's very little reflection of this type in Canada? I mean, Canada is right next to us, and they have very similar problems. Why?
That's Steve's, right?
Canada. Canada has a very interesting and different story than the U.S. And the story of fire in Canada is essentially driven by the political structure of the Canadian Confederation, which is a very different nation state than the U.S. Up until 1930, Canada, in its western provinces, had a huge federal holding, a national forest system, modeled very much on the U.S. In fact, the U.S. Forest Service sent some officers there to help advise them and set it up. And they had a very extensive program, very similar to the U.S. They just didn't have the resources to manage it. And in 1930, they decided they would cede all of that federal land to the provinces so that the western provinces could have complete control over all of their natural resources as the eastern provinces did. At that point, the national story of fire in Canada ends. There is no national narrative. It is all of the provinces individually doing what they would like. They have found, beginning in the 79 through 81 fire seasons, as kind of rolling thunder across the boreal forest. The individual provinces, even the more powerful ones, couldn't handle their own problems, so they decided that they would have to create an interagency institution so that they could share fire suppression resources. Even that was not enough to bring them together. What brought the Canadians together was a treaty that had been negotiated for many years between the U.S. and Canada to share resources. Canadian provinces then realized that if they, which they wanted, because that would give them access to more resources to do the same thing, rather than have to re-examine the fundamentals, that all of the ranking of Canadian fires would be made in Boise, Idaho. And at that point, they preferred the devil they knew to the U.S., and decided they wanted to do that themselves. They would create a counteragency where that would rank Canadian needs. That is done as a corporation. That is not a government institution, as a National Interagency Fire Center is in the U.S., because that would have given the government, the federal government in Canada, control over decisions that are properly in the provinces. So the provinces have developed very sharp, very skilled fire suppression organizations. Great pumps, great hoses, great airplanes, great firefighting crews, great rappelling techniques. They are so well honed in some of the provinces that prior to the 2003 season, it was actually debated in British Columbia about privatizing it outright. I mean, it's just a service. Why do you need government agents to do this? Just like picking up garbage or paving roads. You'll just hire people to do it. They're very good firefighters. And you're thinking, well, what about land management? What about fire and land management? That's not a discussion. So the 2003 fires were so explosive in BC that the fire became a public safety issue and hence a political issue, and no politician was going to pursue this further and shut it down. What Canada can't do is to muster the resources, collective resources, for prescribed fire. The one agency that does that is Parks Canada, but that's the exception that proves the rule because it's a federal institution, that it has sort of the surplus capital and intellectual to pursue that. You do not see fire and land management connected in Canada, in the provinces. It's very interesting. Well, I could go on for this. I've just written this book, which finally got published last year. If you want to know the dirty details and the thrilling stories, come on up and I'll show it to you. Canada is very different. You do not see a debate on fundamentals. The consistent theme in Canadian fire is efficiency, finding more resources and using them better to pursue a given task. That task is fire suppression. And there is some talk about going beyond this and that. That has never been a driver. They are willing to pull back from some of the areas. They have a kind of line of control far across the provinces to the north, and they are willing to pull back, and they call this now prescribed fire. They call burning logging / prescribed fire, but prescribed fire for sort of ecological benefit isn't there, except in Parks Canada. They don't ask those kinds of fundamental questions, and I think, again, it goes back to the Canadian political model that you don't ask fundamental questions because you're not going to agree.
Thank you.
You keep it on technical issues. You talk about pumps.
I'm being signaled
Anyway.
by our organizers here that we have run out of time, and it's too bad because we could talk a while on this. But thanks very much to the panelists and for the audience.
Pleasure to meet you again. All the best.